You're listening to the Nourish Child Podcast, episode number 48.
Welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey, welcome to the Nourish Child. Jill here, your host, and I am so excited to start the new year. Happy 2018. It's hard to believe how much, or how fast, rather, time flies. As you know, the Nourish Child podcast is a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids and dealing with the ups and downs of raising healthy ones, inside and out. And today we are talking about starting solids with your baby. And my guest today is pediatric dietitian Natalia Stasenko. You can find today's show notes with all the links I mentioned over at jillcastle.com/048. That's 048 for episode number 48. Now, if you tuned in to episode number 46, I had Leslie Schilling, co-author of Born to Eat, on the show, and we talked about using the baby-led weaning approach and setting your baby up for a healthy relationship with food. If you didn't listen to that one, make sure you do, because it is a nice tie-in to what we'll be talking about today with Natalia. Starting your baby on solids is a huge step, and it is so very important. I never make the assumption that parents know everything about this journey because A, there's a lot to know, and B, a lot has changed in recent years. One thing I want all of you to know is that there are good resources out there that showcase the latest science and evidence on starting solids. Someone recently asked me for a holistic approach to feeding a 1-year-old. I said, what does that mean? The term holistic approach is so loosey-goosey, I didn't understand. They clarified and said they wanted to feed whole foods, which is great. But remember, as I outlined in my book, The Smart Mom's Guide to Starting Solids, it's not just about the food. It's about making sure important, and I will use the word critical because they are, nutrients are met. It's about positive feeding in a responsive way. It's about promoting self-feeding and independence. It's about promoting flavor variety and texture variety. The list is long. But today, Natalia is going to offer us even more information to help sort this out. Natalia Stasenko is a registered pediatric dietitian, mother of 3, and founder of feedingbites.com. And that's bites with a Y, not an I. She offers free support for parents in her Facebook group, Feeding Bites, Real Families, Real Meals, and recently released an online resource for parents called Starting Solids, the Stress-Free Way. So let's not wait any longer. Here's Natalia. Hey, Natalia, welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast.
Hi, Jill. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, I'm really excited to talk with you today about starting solids, and I know that you are very passionate about this topic, and I know you've created some really helpful products for parents, and I also know that you like the flexible approach to starting solids. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we get started, why don't you tell us about yourself, your family, your blog, your podcast, your book, whatever you've got going on? Just give us a little background about you.
Sure. Yes, that's fun. Yes, so I'm from Russia originally, and I started hopping around the globe about 15 years ago. So first, I lived in London for 6 years. Then I moved to Toronto, Canada. After that, New York, the United States, and now I'm back in London for 3 years now. So that's pretty much the very, very short version of my recent traveling. But in between, I also managed to change my career from marketing to dietetics. I became a registered dietitian while I was in the US. I graduated with a master's degree in nutrition education from Teachers College, Columbia University. I've also opened a private practice in New York, and I worked consulting, counseling, and giving workshops all over the city for a few years there before I moved back to London. And in London, I basically continue doing very, very similar type of work, but I'm really trying to reach a wider audience this time by transferring most of my content online so that I can really reach a bigger audience, a bigger group of parents. I'm really passionate about helping parents become confident when it comes to feeding their children. And I feel like by being available to a broader group of parents, I can serve better. So in between all this hopping around the globe, I also had 3 children. And the first one was born in London, and the younger 2 were born in New York. And because I had my 3 children in the last 12 years, I feel like I've been exposed to all these different ways of starting solids. And I've tried and I've experimented all of them. And it's really, really fascinating. I'm really fascinated by this specific field.
Yeah. Well, a lot has changed in the last decade with regard to infant nutrition. I mean, the research area, as you well know, has just exploded with all kinds of information from the method of feeding to flavor research to self-feeding to responsive feeding. There's just so much in that area right now that it's wonderful because I think we have similar views about the fact that it's so important that first 2 years of life. Well, all of childhood is really important, but that first 2 to 5 years of life is extremely important for setting the foundation for future health and food choices and healthy eating and just even intelligence and body growth and all that stuff. So it's really encouraging that all this research is coming out and that there is just a lot of wiggle room for how to start solids with your baby.
Yes, definitely. I also feel that interestingly, parents get the least support in this extremely important period, the first 2 to 5 years of life, in terms of, helping to streamline and find their own approach when it comes to feeding their children and really understand all these developmental milestones when it comes to eating. So I feel like there's so much information online that a lot of it is actually conflicting. And I almost wish there was less information, but it was more streamlined to make our lives easier as parents.
Yeah. And I think that is where parents can get really stuck because they get overwhelmed with all the information and they're not exactly sure which way to go. So let's talk about that. What do you think are the most important things that parents should keep in mind when they are getting ready to start their baby on solids?
Well, definitely there's a lot of things to keep in mind, but if I had to pick just a few, I would probably mention these ones. The first one, I think the most important one, is to be guided by the baby's development. And instead of comparing our babies to the babies of other mothers on Facebook or our friends' children, we would want to really pay attention to the baby's developmental readiness for starting this journey of solids, introduction of solids, and also when we're transitioning the baby from one stage to another. So that would be probably the first one, really being guided by the baby's development versus comparing the baby to other children. Also, as I already said, it's really important to pay attention to the readiness cues. Readiness to start solids, readiness to move on to the next step. We don't want to push the babies to transition very, very quickly. We don't want to be overwhelmed by certain deadlines, feeling like we have to introduce a new texture today, or we have to make sure that the baby is eating finger foods when they're 7 months of age. But we want to gently challenge them in a gentle way and give plenty of opportunities to practice. Starting to eat solids is a skill. Learning to eat solid foods is a skill. It's a major, major transition from what and how babies used to eat before. And because it's such an important and big skill, it takes some time to manage. And it's like walking or running. We don't expect babies to all learn how to walk in the same way. And we don't worry necessarily if they don't start walking by 12 months sharp. So we know that there is some wiggle room. So I feel like with starting solids, we also would want to expect some kind of a flexibility here. So, and expecting the babies to develop this skill in their own way, considering their unique development.
Well, sure. And I think that there's this line, I think that as a professional, we know, or as professionals, we know sort of the red flags. So we know that, if a baby hasn't transitioned off of pureed foods by 9 months, that they are more likely to have problems later on with feeding. We know those things, but those aren't necessarily things that parents think about or worry about. And so what I think can happen sometimes is we get this sort of juxtaposition of parents moving along and not knowing necessarily some of the milestones and some of the age and stages that they should be moving through. So they don't know when their baby isn't sort of moving along until it's really obvious and a little too late, perhaps even. Yet at the same time, I completely agree with you that this flexibility and not pushing and being gentle with challenges is essential as well. So there's that. Parents do need to sort of know the milestones, but they don't have to live by them as, black and white rules in terms of starting and stopping and advancing and transitioning. Is that what I hear you're saying? Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when I said that I feel like parents don't get enough support at this stage, this is the support I mean, the information, the knowledge about what are the typical developmental milestones, what should come next, what they should be expecting, and certain things that are pretty obvious to us as feeding experts may be really frustrating for parents. Like, for example, when babies start refusing eating from a spoon at about 8 to 10 months. Very typical, happens almost in every family. At the same time, I know so many parents who become extremely worried and anxious that their baby is not eating and not getting calories. At the same time, it's a very typical developmental stage. Also, another very typical stage is when the babies transition from smooth purees, let's say, to slightly chunkier textures, and how their intake drops suddenly as they start adjusting to this new texture. Again, parents become very worried that the baby is eating less or has more trouble manipulating this food in the mouth, because obviously the new texture can be more challenging. And they step back to smooth purees in an attempt to up their intake to make sure they're getting the calories and nutrition. So yes, I think that empowering parents with the knowledge about the developmental milestones that all babies go through is extremely important. At the same time, within this framework, understanding that all babies develop in different ways. And sometimes, they arrive to these milestones early, and sometimes they arrive to those milestones late, but gently challenging babies as they move along is what I think parents would want to be doing to help them transition smoothly.
And really just also being very tuned in to your baby. And you mentioned the cues for moving on, being really aware and watching for those cues, because I do have some families that I work with that, they're not really tuned in to what's going on with their baby. They're so fearful of their baby not getting enough that they are really hanging on to the sure thing, which is the spoon and purees. And that's not good for baby either. I mean, I see parents holding their children back from advancing unwittingly and unintentionally, but it's that lack of knowledge, that lack of support and early, I think, education of parents that is so key, as you mentioned.
Yes, definitely. I don't remember who, probably it was Ellen Sadler, who said that starting solids is like a journey with the final destination, your child eating the same food as you sitting at a family table. And this journey has multiple stops. So whenever you arrived to a stop when you feel like your baby has mastered a certain skill, like eating smooth puree, you feel like relaxing, unpacking your suitcase and sitting down to chill. But no, you have to have your suitcase packed up and ready to go, because you should be looking out for this next milestone. And your baby, it could be finger foods or lumpy textures or 100% self-feeding. So there will be always those changes that we want to be prepared for, instead of, feeling, oh my goodness, my baby's eating now, I can relax.
Right. And the other thing is to just, let's take a step back here and acknowledge that from 6 months, when baby is, around that age of starting solids, to 12 months, where baby is at the family table eating the family food, that's 6 months. Think about it. So many transitions happening in that very brief time frame. You're right. Keep your bags packed and be on the lookout for the next stop, right?
Yes, and then that happens regardless of the textures the babies are eating, whether they've started with purees or finger foods. You will definitely see a lot of those changes when their skills are developing, when they're able to feed themselves with more mastery, or when they're able to manipulate food with different textures in their mouth more effectively. So that happens all the time.
Mm-hmm. And on a previous episode, I spoke with Karen Ansel about the different baby foods that can be introduced and that progression from pureed to more textured. So I don't want to really discuss the food component so much on this show, but I do want to talk about the different methods that parents can use to start solids. So there's the spoon method. We know there's baby-led weaning method. We know there's a combined approach. Can you kind of summarize those three for the audience and just differentiate them for everybody so they understand the differences?
Yes, sure. So the traditional spoon approach is based on the premise that babies are supposed to be fed with a spoon from the beginning, with the texture very gradually being adjusted so that they are challenged in an appropriate way while they're developing their skills. With a traditional way of starting solids, finger foods are typically introduced a little bit later, at about 8 months of age, and they are cut in smaller pieces so that the babies can self-feed them using their fingers, so pincer grasp. So this is, in short, the traditional way to start solids. With baby-led weaning, on the other hand, a spoon feeding is not used typically. The only way spoons are used in the feeding is when they're preloaded with baby food so that the baby can feed them, holding them by the handle, and the baby can use a preloaded spoon with a puree on it to feed himself without the parents' help. So the parents only help at the stage when they scoop the food using the spoon, and then they pass it to the baby, and then they use this preloaded spoon to feed themselves.
Mm-hmm.
With baby-led weaning, babies are supposed to start eating long or coin-shaped, graspable pieces of finger foods from the beginning. And again, use purees only with a preloaded spoon.
Mm-hmm.
With mixed approach to feeding, both textures can be introduced at the beginning. Research shows that around 60% of babies can pick up finger food and bring it to the mouth when they're 6 months of age. And as they grow, by 7-8 months of age, even almost all babies can do that. They can pick up larger pieces of finger foods and bring them to mouth.
Mm-hmm.
That means that many babies are capable of mastering those self-feeding skills from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, they are not eating that much using this approach because, as you know, when they are eating finger foods, a lot of food ends up on the floor because they're not able to bite, to manipulate the food in the mouth properly.
Mm-hmm.
And here's where purees are coming in, because using purees at the same time helps in two ways. Well, first, it helps to provide the important nutrition, especially for babies who are not very skilled at finger foods from the beginning, or they're just less interested, because let's face it, some babies just don't have as much interest in self-feeding until a little bit later, 8 or even 9 months of age. So in this case, spoon feeding or using purees in whichever way, whether the baby uses a preloaded spoon or the parents are feeding the baby with a spoon, helps to close this potential nutritional gap. And actually, another beneficial effect of spoon feeding is that it helps babies to develop this another set of feeding skills when they are learning to scoop the puree off the spoon using their lips, when they're learning to manipulate the puree in their mouth, moving it towards the back of their throat and swallowing it. It's actually another set of important skills that they're learning using their purees.
Right. Yeah, I think, I have a couple of speech pathologist friends who really do get into some of the details around how feeding just that transition of puree to family food helps those mouth muscles, trains them, if you will, to be ready for language development.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. It's not something that parents should avoid at all costs. I know that in baby-led weaning community, feeding with a spoon is almost associated with force feeding. I don't think it has to be this way. There's definitely a responsive way to feed solids using purees, using a spoon, and it's something that we should be striving towards. And also, I forgot to mention that the flexible approach to starting solids helps not only those babies who are slower at picking up those self-feeding skills, but it also works great for babies who reject spoon from the beginning, because, there is also a big number of babies who hate being fed with a spoon. And I know that parents who kind of set their minds to use the traditional way of starting solids become so worried because they don't know what to feed their baby now that the spoon is out of the question. And I think with the flexible approach, yes. So when the babies have these regular opportunities to experience finger foods and to practice self-feeding, it allows them to get the nutrition that they need and develop the skills that they need, even though they refuse the spoon.
This episode of the Nourished Child podcast is sponsored by Health IQ, an insurance company that helps health-conscious people get lower rates on their life insurance. I'm all for raising healthy, nourished kids, and you also know I believe that raising a healthy child is a whole lot easier when mom and dad are living an active, healthy lifestyle. 50 million Americans live health-conscious lives, and studies show when people are physically active on a regular basis, they have a lower risk of heart disease, cancer, and diabetes compared to those who aren't active. I think health-conscious people should get better rates and coverage from insurance companies. Don't you? That's exactly what Health IQ is all about. Health IQ rewards health-conscious consumers with lower rates on their life insurance. Just like saving money on your car insurance for being a good driver, Health IQ saves you money on your life insurance for living a health-conscious lifestyle. If you're serious about your health, get your free quote today from Health IQ and see if you qualify. Go to healthiq.com/nourished. Right. I'm getting ready to do a presentation, a webinar on the nutrients, the importance of nutrients, including protein, iron, and zinc, choline, all the different nutrients that are so important in the first year of life. And when you start to really dig into the research and look at the nutrients and how they relate to brain development and body growth, but most importantly, brain development, there's not really a lot of wiggle room in the first couple of years of life to miss out on nutrients, to grow a gap that could be there just from that transition from exclusively breastfeeding to solid food. I mean, there's just not a whole lot of wiggle room to miss out on nutrients. So personally and professionally, I really like the combined approach because just as you say, there will always be some babies who are ready to go, full-fledged baby-led weaning, starting those solids, but there will always be babies who aren't quite ready. And we don't really have a month or two to waste in terms of not meeting their nutritional requirements at that early age.
Yes, definitely. With baby-led weaning, as you probably also know, a lot of first foods that are recommended are typically fruits or vegetables. They're not the best foods to start solids with in terms of nutrition, because all the nutrients that you mentioned, they come from different types of food. And these types of food is not something that is easy to feed babies as finger foods. I have a whole blog post on iron-rich finger foods for baby-led weaning, because I know how difficult it is to integrate iron-rich finger foods in the first couple of months when baby-led weaning babies are just learning to manage all the textures.
Yeah, I will link to that post because I think people will really enjoy some of those recommendations from you in terms of iron-rich finger foods. And I also will link to a post that I wrote about just the status, the importance of iron if you are using baby-led weaning. And I think that's the crux of what we're trying to do here, or what I'm trying to do, is just help parents who are making these different feeding choices or feeding method choices just to make sure they have the information that they need to be really successful at doing it. And so I think that will be a really great link to include in this show.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. Another thing I wanted to mention is that although I love baby-led weaning and I know a lot of families who use it very successfully, I think that it doesn't support parents as their children, the babies grow up and become toddlers. That's another thing why I think that mixed approach to feeding, where we are learning to understand the development and the normal feeding behavior in children.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by doesn't support their development as toddlers?
It doesn't support parents as their babies change and become toddlers. I have so many parents whose babies have been amazing eaters when they just started solids, and now the baby has become a toddler and she's maybe 18 months of age, and parents reverse back to spoon feeding in an attempt to override this very typical picky eating behavior that starts at around this age. And I feel like with baby-led weaning, we allow the babies to self-regulate and we trust them around foods while they're learning all these textures and they're very excited about new foods. And you and I both know that this is this unique window of opportunities when babies are most open to sampling new food. And that's why baby-led weaning can be such an exciting period and such an exciting approach for many parents. But then this typical toddler pickiness clicks in and we are lost and we don't know what to do because we think that we have done everything right. We have started with baby-led weaning and our toddlers still turned out to be quite picky. Versus when we know more about the child development, when we know about all these normal developmental milestones and we expect the low appetite and the pickiness starting at about 1-2 years of age, we are prepared for that. So we know that baby-led weaning doesn't guarantee a child who would eat everything in sight 1 or 2 years or 3 years or 5 years down the road, but it's just another way to start solids with babies who love this way of eating.
So what you're saying is it doesn't really matter the method that you use, that there are certain developmental milestones that will exist regardless of whether you spoon feed or baby-led wean or you do a combined approach. Babies, children, toddlers are still going to go through these very predictable developmental milestones, including picky eating, as they grow.
Yes, precisely. Yes. So baby-led weaning is not a magical tool that will help to raise a perfect eater. It's just another way to start solids, which is more responsive, but it doesn't mean that we cannot feed our babies using spoon in a responsive way as well.
So I want to segue just a little bit because you brought up the Facebook topic, and what I find is so interesting, and we can just sort of hash back and forth on this, is that, Facebook is such a great medium for spreading information, but I also see it becoming a little bit divisive and almost counterproductive in some ways. Do you have any insight on that or viewpoint on that, or are you seeing the same thing? I don't know.
Definitely. I'm receiving emails from
Maybe
parents.
it's just me.
Absolutely. No, I'm getting emails almost every day from parents who found my website and read about the mixed approach to starting solids, and they feel so relieved because some of them have been actually banned from the baby-led winning Facebook groups when they just ask the question about the puree that they tried to with their baby. Just mentioning it, by mentioning it, they had to leave the group because of this. So this is very sad. I feel like, unfortunately, starting solids in a certain way just becomes a different way to make us parents feel bad about the choices that we make.
Almost like a shaming. And it also sort of feels like the method that you choose is a social movement, if you will.
Yeah, I have the same feeling. I think that baby-led weaning is becoming this cool way to start solids, and all other ways are less cool. And obviously, parents who want the best, we all want the best for our children. And we want to do the thing that everybody says is going to work miracles. But what if this approach is not going to work for us?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point. And I think when you can put the child first and the nutritional requirements and just the job of what is supposed to happen during that first couple of years of life, that it's, you're supposed to meet nutritional needs. You're supposed to help that child learn how to eat and develop all those skills you mentioned earlier. And we know there are pros and cons with every method. There are pros and cons with spoon feeding too. I mean, there's plenty of research out there that does show that, babies can be overfed when they are spoon fed. They can be fed in an unresponsive way where the parent is not paying attention to the baby's cues and is more willing to finish out that jar or, make sure the bowl of food is completely consumed. And there are pros and cons with baby-led weaning too. There's, some wonderful pros of using that method. And there are some big questions about, what, just as you brought up, does it really prevent picky eating? Does it prevent obesity? We have some new research out that's calling that into question. Does it cover nutrient needs? We don't have great research that tells us it absolutely does. And I think the point is there's just so much variability from baby to baby that you can't say that one way is the holy grail for every child.
Yes, definitely. That's why I think that having the bigger picture in mind and having this basic knowledge about how to feed responsibly at every age and stage, from starting solids to feeding an 18-year-old, is extremely important, because this way, regardless of the way we feed solids, we will not overfeed using a puree, and we will transition and we will feed safely using the baby-led weaning without pushing the children beyond their capacity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Natalia, how do you think that parents can make the most of all these different approaches? I mean, if you had to give advice about the spoon or baby-led weaning, some of your top 2 tips if a parent were starting with spoon feeding or if a parent were starting with baby-led weaning or using the combined approach, what would those tips be, and how can parents really make the most of whichever approach they choose?
Yes, definitely. So if parents decide to introduce solids using the traditional approach, I would definitely recommend to stay extremely responsive to the baby and being guided by the baby's cues rather than the size of the baby food jar, because this is probably the most important thing to do when we're just starting solids with a baby. We don't want to turn it into negative experience trying just to make sure that this jar of food has been emptied by the end of the meal. So we don't want to get pushy with a spoon. We also want to challenge the babies gently. As I said, do not sit down and unpack your suitcase until the baby is eating the same food as you are eating at the dinner table. So keep upgrading the texture, keep moving them along in a gentle way. And one of the ways we can do that is always serving finger foods, even if the baby throws them on the floor, even if she pays no attention to them. There should always be exposure to foods she can practice self-feeding. So that's something that is really important to keep in mind. Even if the baby is eating 100% puree, there should always be something that she can explore with the fingers and try to self-feed.
Great point.
With baby-led weaning, I would focus on a different set of foods from what you see on typical baby-led weaning forums and websites. I would definitely focus on foods that are rich in iron and zinc, which are extremely important nutrients in the first 2 years of life. And I wouldn't fear the spoon like we see with a lot of parents. I wouldn't have this fear of the spoon, as I call it. Another thing I would recommend is not to fall into what I call the muffin trap. And that's basically baking everything into those cube egg-based concoctions. Again, you can see so many of those recipes online. It feels like this is the only thing that baby-led weaning babies eat, when we try to hide all these vegetables in eggs or muffins and just feed them to the babies. We want them to be exposed to food in its natural state. So minimally processed, minimally prepared finger food ideas would be the best start if we want to get the most out of baby-led weaning. And I think I sent you the link to one of the blog posts. I think it's the most popular blog post on my website up to date. And it has 65 whole food finger food ideas for babies from 6 months of age.
Perfect.
And another thing I would recommend for parents who are experimenting with baby-led weaning is being prepared for the normal toddler behavior in terms of eating. Being prepared for a lower appetite and more fussiness and choosiness in their eating when our babies approach the toddler stage. Mm-hmm. And I have a post on the website I will share a link with you that describes typical toddler eating behavior in my third child, who was self-feeding everything and eating in a wonderful way until she turned about 16 months of age. And then everything changed dramatically. And that was very, very normal.
Okay, great. I'll include those links in the show notes. Perfect.
Thank you. And if parents decide to experiment with the mixed approach, I think that keeping your mind very open in terms of what your baby may like, this can be very useful. So, for example, we would want to serve a variety of textures, purees, and finger foods, and really letting the baby choose which way she wants to learn to eat first. Some babies go straight to finger foods, and some babies go through all these different stages with puree at first, when the texture is adjusted as they progress, as they learn. So all babies are different, and we want to keep our mind open, and we want to be guided by their unique development. And that's why I think mixed approach is something that can work for many, many parents, many, many families who have trouble choosing between the two, baby-led weaning or the traditional one.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. I think that's great advice and really casts a wide net over a lot of different parenting philosophies and approaches and allows for a wide difference from baby to baby. So I really like that. Okay. So what are you working on now, Natalia? Do you want to share with our audience some of the things that you have going, percolating in your business?
Yes, sure. So I'm working on setting up a new membership platform for the parents that I'm working with. And I hope to consolidate all my online classes, including the one on starting solids, on this platform. Mm-hmm. I hope to integrate an access to menu planning service and also a variety of interviews with experts in the field of pediatric nutrition. So I think that could be a very, very exciting new project. And I think that a lot of parents may benefit from it, especially because I hope to structure it in a way that it's created as a series of small nutritional bites of information. So it's not something that you would need to sit down and spend hours reading or listening or viewing in order to get the benefit. It's almost like an easy to customize tool that you would want to use just to get a quick solution for a certain feeding problem and also support in other areas where you feel you need support. So that's a big project that I'm working on right now.
Sounds like a big project.
It is.
Anything else you want or my listeners to know about? I know you do have a Starting Solids book. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I have an ebook, which is actually an ebook bundle. It consists of 2 larger ebooks and a few shorter ebooks or longer PDFs, however you want to call them. And also I included recently a new feature into this program, and this is a set of videos, a series of videos of a baby progressing through the different stages of learning how to self-feed. I think it's quite fascinating to watch how an individual baby goes from one step to another. So this is an additional feature. So it's not just an ebook, it's actually an online program that includes some reading material, some recipes, and also this series with a baby learning how to eat. And I would invite everybody who has questions about feeding their babies or older children to join our Facebook group, which is called Feeding Bites, Real Families, Real Meal. It's growing so fast, and we are getting so many great feedback from the parents who have joined us. It's only about a year old, but I feel like we've achieved so much and we've helped so many people. I run it with another dietitian, Adina Pearson from Healthy Little Eaters. And we also have a few moderators who help us because there's just so many interesting things happening, so many different discussions that I think we wouldn't be able to do just Adina and I alone.
Yeah, no, I have noticed it's really taken off in the last few months, I think.
Yes, it's been amazing.
Yeah.
We're very happy with this project.
Okay, so listeners can find you on Facebook. I've got your website, feedingbites.com. Anywhere else listeners can connect with you?
I think these are the two main places, my blog and my presence on Facebook on my Facebook page, Feeding Bites, and also in the Facebook group. I think I'm more active in the Facebook group now because it keeps us so busy. Mm-hmm. But the Facebook page is where I post all the blog posts, all the important pieces of information that can support parents in their feeding journey.
Wonderful. I will make sure to include all those links in the show notes. Natalia, thank you so much for coming on The Nourished Child and sharing your advice and perspective on feeding and starting solids.
Thank you so much, Jill, again, for inviting me. It was a pleasure and honor. Thank you.
My pleasure. I love networking. I'm part of a podcast network called Parents on Demand, or the Pod Network. We are a network of fun and educational podcasts perfect for your family. You can explore the shows in the network by going to parentsondemand.com and searching specific categories. Parents on Demand also has a download for a free network app on iOS and Android, so you can listen to your favorite shows or find new podcasts. Subscribe through iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, iHeartRadio, or another provider. Every month, I will feature a podcast that I think will be helpful or of interest to you. Here's this month's podcast feature.
Hi, this is Dr. Mike from Nationwide Children's Hospital and host of Pediacast, a pediatric podcast for parents. Each week, we cover pediatric news, answer listener questions, and interview pediatric and parenting experts. You can find Pediacast wherever you get your podcasts and on the web at pediacast.org. We care about the health and well-being of your kids and family, and we'd love to have you join us on Pediacast.
Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Natalia. She has a lot of good insight and practical solutions. Be sure to check out her website and resources, especially those yummy food ideas and recipes for little ones. Don't forget you can find today's episode and the show notes over at jillcastle.com/048. And hey, can you do me a favor? Help me nourish and grow this show. To do so, you can write a review on iTunes, subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Google Play Music, iHeartRadio, and more. You could also share the podcast on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, Instagram, wherever you hang out. And hey, if you still find yourself wanting more information on starting solids, check out my blog, The Nourished Child, where I have several articles, particularly one called How to Start First Foods for Baby, where I have a free printable summarizing the pros and cons of all the feeding methods and a free guide to the nutrients you need to pay attention to in that first year. These 2 free guides will certainly help you make a more informed choice. As always, thank you for joining me today. I'm so grateful you choose to spend time with this show and with me. And I also am very committed to helping you raise children who are well-nourished inside and out. Be sure to give that child in your life, big or small, a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.